Chapter 1. A morning ritual that shocked her. The UN Magellan, a sleek, mid-sized exploratory vessel of the United Earth Navy, drifted through the endless void of deep space, its reinforced hull reflecting the distant light of a blue-white star. It had been weeks since the crew had last set foot on a habitable world, and the monotony of their daily routines had settled into an unshakable rhythm. The hum of the ship's life support systems, the low-frequency vibrations of the engines, and the occasional chime of communication logs were the only sounds that filled the corridors in the early morning hours. For Lieutenant Ethan Cole, a xenobiologist stationed aboard the Magellan, mornings followed an almost religious routine. He had always been a creature of habit: wake up, stretch, check the overnight data logs, and then, most importantly, brew his morning coffee. It was a ritual, a moment of sanity in an otherwise unpredictable life of deep space research. The problem was that their newest crew member, Rilla Vex of the Tari, did not share that appreciation. Rilla was a diplomat in training, sent by the Tari homeworld to study human customs and improve diplomatic relations between their species. The Tari were a reptilian humanoid race, known for their superior olfactory senses and their strict dietary requirements. To her species, ingesting anything remotely toxic was unthinkable. Their metabolism was efficient, refined over thousands of years of evolutionary perfection, and their digestive systems filtered out any substances deemed harmful, which was why, on that particular morning, when Ethan sat down at the mess hall table with a steaming cup of dark, freshly brewed coffee, Rilla's reaction was one of pure, unfiltered horror. Her slitted amber eyes widened, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air. She recoiled, her crest-like frills twitching in distress. Sniff, sniff. What is that? She demanded, her normally smooth, lilting voice tight with alarm. Ethan, who had been half asleep before taking his first sip, blinked at her reaction. Coffee, he answered, as if the answer should have been obvious. Rilla's expression only grew more panicked. She leaned forward, her scales shifting in color slightly, a Tari trait that usually signified intense concern or disgust. She sniffed again, then quickly backed away as if the scent had physically assaulted her nostrils. "You drink this?" she exclaimed, pointing at the black liquid in his mug, like it was some sort of chemical weapon. Ethan frowned. "Yeah, every morning." "Why?" Rilla's tail flicked behind her, her posture becoming more rigid. That is poison." Ethan nearly choked on his sip. "What?" "It smells like a concentrated neurotoxin," she continued, clearly disturbed. "My ancestors were hunters, survivalists, experts at detecting what could kill us, and that smell? That's something that should kill you. How can you drink that?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, then grinned, suddenly understanding her reaction. "Oh, you mean the caffeine?" He held up his mug proudly. "Yeah, humans drink this stuff all the time. It helps wake us up." Rilla looked at him as if he had just admitted to injecting himself with venom for fun. "You willingly consume a stimulant poison every day?" "Well, yeah," he replied, taking another sip with exaggerated enjoyment. "We kinda need it. It keeps us alert, keeps the brain sharp." Rilla shook her head in disbelief, her scales darkening slightly, a clear sign of deep unease. "But your nervous system, your heart rate, that much stimulation would send a Tari into cardiac arrest. How can your species tolerate it?" Ethan chuckled. "Because we evolved for it. Humans have a pretty tough metabolism. We process all kinds of weird stuff. Caffeine is just a mild stimulant for us." Rilla was still staring at him, utterly unconvinced. That can't be good for you." Ethan grinned and raised his mug. "Tell that to the billions of humans back home who drink this stuff every single day." Rilla, looking thoroughly disturbed, continued to study his cup as if it were a dangerous alien artifact. And that was how the great coffee debate between humans and the Tari officially began. The Great Coffee Debate. Over the following days, Rilla became increasingly obsessed with studying human caffeine consumption. It wasn't just that she found it horrifying, she couldn't understand it. She had spent her life in academic study, learning about biology, chemistry, and the intricacies of alien physiology, but this made no logical sense. How could a species consume a neurotoxin on a daily basis without suffering any long-term consequences? More importantly, why would they want to? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, she began collecting data. At first, it was simple. She watched Ethan drink his morning coffee, measuring his heart rate, pupil dilation, and cognitive response times. To her growing horror, his body reacted exactly as she predicted. His heart rate spiked, his neuroelectric activity surged, and his stress levels increased. But instead of suffering any negative consequences, he seemed perfectly fine. More than fine. He actually functioned better. When she confronted him with her findings, he had simply shrugged. Yeah, that's the point. It makes us more productive. That answer only frustrated her further. But it's dangerous, she argued. You're artificially elevating your nervous system's output. That's completely unsustainable. Ethan just laughed. Rilla, humans are walking contradictions. We do lots of unsustainable things. That answer did not reassure her. And so, she took her research to the rest of the human crew. The results were the same. All of them drank coffee. All of them reacted similarly. And none of them seemed concerned in the slightest. Rilla was at her breaking point. It's like you're all just ignoring basic survival instincts, she ranted one evening, pacing the length of the mess hall while Ethan casually sipped his third cup of the day. Your bodies are telling you that this substance is a threat, and yet you ignore it. Ethan smirked. Maybe we're just stubborn like that. Rilla stopped pacing, turning to look at him with a sudden realization. That's it, she murmured, her eyes widening. Ethan blinked. What's it? She pointed at him. Your species' entire evolutionary advantage is sheer, unrelenting stubbornness. Ethan thought about that for a moment, then grinned. Yeah, that sounds about right. Rilla groaned, rubbing her temples. I will never understand humans. Ethan took a slow, exaggerated sip of his coffee, looking entirely too satisfied. And yet, you're still trying. She glared at him. This argument was far from over. But for now, the coffee drinkers had won. Chapter 2. Rilla's Dangerous Experiment. The debate over human caffeine consumption had become a full-scale obsession for Rillavex of the Tari. It had started with horror and disbelief, then turned into scientific curiosity, and now it had escalated into something far more dangerous and uncontrollable need for answers. For days, she had watched Lieutenant Ethan Cole and the rest of the human crew consume their so-called liquid poison without suffering any ill effects. Every morning, they ingested what, by all logical accounts, should have been a dangerous neurostimulant, and yet, instead of succumbing to sickness or collapse, they functioned better. Their cognitive performance increased, their reflexes sharpened, and their overall efficiency improved. To Rilla, this defied everything she understood about biology, chemistry, and survival instincts. Her people, the Tari, had evolved with an extreme sensitivity to toxins, capable of detecting harmful substances through olfactory receptors far more advanced than any human could comprehend. This ability had helped them thrive in hostile environments, avoiding poisonous plants, contaminated water, and predatory threats for thousands of years. Ingesting even the smallest amount of a toxic compound would trigger an immediate rejection response in their bodies, leading to convulsions, nausea, or worse. By all known logic, caffeine should have had a similar effect. And yet, it didn't. At least, not in humans. This inconsistency gnawed at her. She had run countless simulations, examined every variable, mapped every known effect of methylxanthine alkaloids on various species throughout the galaxy, and still, she couldn't explain it. Her frustration mounted, until she came to one unavoidable conclusion. If she wanted to truly understand human caffeine tolerance, she would have to test it on herself. The forbidden experiment. The idea was madness. Even as the thought entered her mind, every instinct screamed at her to reject it. Her training, her years of biological expertise, her very genetic heritage, all of it warned against the stupidity of what she was about to do. Kari physiology was fundamentally different from human physiology. What they consumed was not designed for her. It could kill her. And yet, she had to know. With painstaking precision, she began preparations. She recalibrated the medical scanners in her quarters to monitor her vitals in real time. She synthesized an isolated caffeine compound, extracting only the stimulant itself from human coffee, removing any additional compounds that could further complicate her metabolism. She set up emergency stabilizers in case her body reacted poorly. A direct infusion of neutralizing enzymes could be injected into her bloodstream within seconds if the worst happened. She left detailed instructions for the ship's medical AI, just in case she became incapacitated. And finally, she took a deep breath, lifted the small vial of pure caffeine solution, and stared at it. This was it, the ultimate test, the moment she had been preparing for. If human evolution had truly developed a metabolic process that could neutralize toxic compounds, then this experiment would prove it. If not, she'd be waking up in the ship's infirmary if she woke up at all. The first dose. Rilla hesitated only for a second before tipping the vial back and letting a single drop of caffeine touch her tongue. The effect was immediate. A sharp, bitter taste exploded across her senses, far more intense than she had anticipated. Her body seized in response, her frills flaring outward, her breath catching in her throat. Her neural receptors fired off warning signals, flooding her system with instinctual distress messages, her physiology registering the foreign substance as a potential toxin. For several tense seconds, she remained completely still, waiting for the worst. Her heart pounded, her chest tightened, her muscles coiled in preparation for a violent rejection. But then, nothing. The intensity faded. Her body, having prepared for a catastrophic biological response, seemed almost confused. It had detected a stimulant, but it hadn't been lethal. She felt warmth spread through her limbs, a strange, alien sensation that made her pulse quicken. A rush of clarity followed, her senses sharpening in a way she had never experienced before. Her mind became alert, aware, hyper-focused. She could hear the hum of the ship's engines more clearly, could detect the subtle fluctuations in atmospheric pressure, could feel the individual vibrations in the metal beneath her feet. She blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by the sudden hyper-awareness. This was what humans felt every morning. She reached for her data pad, her hands moving faster than she had anticipated, her reactions sharper, more precise. Her cognitive processing had increased dramatically, her thoughts forming at a speed that made her usual methodical reasoning feel sluggish by comparison. Her eyes widened in shock. The humans hadn't been exaggerating. Caffeine was a performance enhancer, and it was working on her. The aftermath. At first, Rilla was exhilarated. She documented everything, noting every physiological change, every spike in neural activity, every increase in reaction time. She understood now why humans consumed it so readily. It was like unlocking a part of herself she never knew existed. But then, things started to go wrong. Her heart rate, already elevated, began to climb higher. Her limbs trembled without command, small involuntary muscle spasms twitching along her arms. Her breathing grew rapid, shallow, her chest tightening as her body struggled to regulate itself. The stimulation did not stop. It kept escalating. She tried to remain calm, to run diagnostics, but her fingers moved too fast, her thoughts racing beyond her ability to control them. Panic set in. She stumbled to the emergency stabilizer, barely managing to activate the failsafe before her body completely lost control. The injection fired directly into her veins, releasing a dose of counteractive enzymes, forcing her nervous system to stabilize. The effects of the caffeine finally began to subside. Her vision blurred. Her body felt exhausted, drained, and then darkness. Ethan finds out. When Rilla regained consciousness, the first thing she saw was Ethan Cole's face hovering over her, his expression a mixture of concern, amusement, and exasperation. "You did it, didn't you?" he said, arms crossed, shaking his head. Rilla groaned, her body still recovering from the overload. "I needed to understand." Ethan sighed. "You poisoned yourself?" She bristled. "It wasn't poison. It was scientific inquiry." He raised an eyebrow. "Scientific inquiry that almost put you in cardiac arrest?" She looked away. "Not possibly." Ethan ran a hand over his face, muttering something under his breath. "You Tkari are supposed to be the smart ones. What the hell possessed you to drink caffeine?" She hesitated, then admitted, "I did not expect it to be so effective." Ethan sighed. "Yeah, well, now you know why humans love it. And also why you should never, ever drink it again." Rilla grumbled something under her breath. But deep down, she had to admit, even though the experience had nearly fried her nervous system, For a few fleeting moments, she had never felt so alive. Chapter 3. Rilla's Revenge, the Ultimate Human Challenge. The HFY Magellan was a ship of science, diplomacy, and exploration. But for the last few days, the tension in the air had reached a level usually reserved for military engagements. The conflict? A silent, undeclared war between Rillavex and Lieutenant Ethan Cole. It had been 2 days since Rilla's disastrous experiment with caffeine. She had nearly overloaded her nervous system, suffered acute physiological distress, and been lectured endlessly by Ethan. His smug, self-righteous tone had been unbearable. "See? I told you it was a bad idea," he had said, far too many times. "I don't think you understand how lucky you are," he had added, shaking his head like some disappointed mentor. And worst of all, he had laughed. She could still hear it, that insufferable human chuckle, that irritating tone of amusement, as if he found the fact that she had nearly poisoned herself funny. Her pride was wounded beyond repair. So now, it was personal. If humans could drink caffeine like it was harmless water, then she would find something that humans couldn't handle. Something that would humble Ethan Cole the way he had humbled her. Something that would prove, once and for all, that humans were not the invincible, chaos-loving creatures they claimed to be. And she knew exactly how to do it. The challenge begins. Rilla spent the next 48 hours meticulously preparing her counterattack. The challenge had to be fair. She refused to resort to biological trickery or underhanded tactics. She needed something natural, something humans had no evolutionary defense against. And then she found it. It was perfect. When the morning mess hall doors slid open, Ethan found Rilla already seated at their usual table, her tail coiled neatly around her chair, her posture serene, confident, and utterly unreadable. Ethan, as always, had his morning coffee in hand. But something was off. He could feel it. He approached with caution, setting his coffee down and narrowing his eyes at the Takari scientist who was far too smug for her own good. "You're up early," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. Rilla tilted her head, her frills twitching slightly with feigned innocence. "I simply wish to share breakfast with you, Lieutenant. After all, we have unfinished business." Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee. And what kind of unfinished business are we talking about?" Rilla pressed a button on the table, and a service drone hovered into view, carrying a sleek, temperature-controlled container. The lid hissed as it opened, releasing a sharp, pungent aroma into the room. Ethan's eyes widened instantly. His muscles tensed. His brain immediately registered danger. It was spicy. It was unreasonably spicy. It was something so potently powerful that his survival instincts kicked in before he could even process what was happening. Rilla's smug grin widened. "You have your human coffee," she said smoothly. "I have the traditional spice blend of my people." She reached into the container and retrieved a small, jade-colored fruit, no larger than a grape. Its skin glistened slightly under the ship's artificial lights. Ethan could already feel his sinuses reacting, and he hadn't even touched it yet. Rilla held it between two claws. "This is a Gorthaka pepper, the most potent spice known to the Takari. It is harmless to my species, but to most others." She gave a slow, deliberate blink. "Well, let's just say it would be quite the experience." Ethan took a careful step back. "I don't like where this is going." Rilla picked up a second Gorthaka pepper and tossed it toward him. He caught it on reflex, but the moment his fingers made contact, a faint, burning sensation spread across his palm. His eyes snapped to hers. She was enjoying this way too much. "You want me to eat this," he said flatly. "I do not simply want you to eat it," Rilla said smoothly. "I want you to experience it. You see, humans believe themselves to be incredibly resilient, do they not? Your kind boasts about your ability to consume caffeine, alcohol, raw protein, fermented substances, and an array of other toxins. But I have studied human biology extensively, and I have discovered a significant weakness in your kind." Ethan frowned. "And that would be?" Rilla leaned forward, her amber eyes gleaming. "Spice." Ethan's stomach sank. "You see," she continued, "Takari physiology is uniquely adapted to withstand the most extreme levels of capsaicin and other related compounds. Our ancestors evolved on a homeworld filled with harsh vegetation, where developing a resistance to such stimulants was necessary for survival. Humans, however." She tilted her head, watching him like a predator enjoying the final moments before the kill. Well, let's just say your pain receptors are overly dramatic when it comes to such stimuli. Ethan stared at the pepper in his hand. Oh, hell. She had him. This was payback. He could already feel the sweat forming at the back of his neck. He wasn't a coward, and he wasn't about to let her win, but he knew what was coming, and it was going to hurt. A lot. The taste of defeat. The moment Ethan bit into the Gorthaka pepper, his entire body rebelled against existence. The heat hit instantly, no warning, no slow build-up, just pure, unfiltered agony igniting every nerve in his mouth. His brain short-circuited. His lungs forgot how to function. His soul briefly left his body and reconsidered its choices. His vision blurred as his body desperately attempted to process what it had just been subjected to. Sweat poured down his temples. His hands clenched into fists as the fire spread from his mouth down his throat, searing every inch of his digestive system like molten lava. Across the table, Rilla was smiling serenely, chewing on her own Gorthaka pepper like it was nothing. Nothing. She hadn't even flinched. Ethan slammed his hands on the table, his body trembling from sheer overload. He had eaten spicy food before, but this was not normal. This was not food. This was biological warfare. He choked out, gasping for breath. You knew this would happen. Rilla folded her hands together, looking entirely too satisfied. Of course. I am a scientist, after all. My research is thorough. Ethan wheezed. I hate you. She mused. Is that the spice talking? Or are you simply not accustomed to losing? He reached for his coffee, desperate for relief. But the moment he swallowed, the heat doubled. His entire body convulsed. Rilla chuckled, sipping a cool glass of water. I believe the humans have a phrase for this, she said with mock thoughtfulness. Ah yes. Checkmate. Ethan groaned, head dropping to the table. She had one, and he would never hear the end of it. Chapter 4. The final round, a truce over breakfast. The UN Magellan's mess hall was filled with the soft hum of machinery, the quiet clinking of utensils, and the occasional conversation between crew members, all of whom had unknowingly become spectators in an unofficial war between human stubbornness and alien pride. But this morning, the battlefield had grown quiet. Ethan Cole, usually the victor in debates about human resilience, was defeated, humbled, and utterly broken. He sat at his usual spot, staring at his untouched breakfast tray, still suffering the consequences of his ill-advised decision to consume a Gorthaka pepper, the tarry death fruit. Across from him sat Rillavex, the smug and entirely too satisfied alien scientist who had orchestrated his downfall. She ate gracefully, taking slow bites of her meal, occasionally sipping her water, and most insultingly of all acting like she had already moved on from the war she had so thoroughly won. Ethan, however, was still suffering. The afterburn from the pepper of doom had lasted far longer than any human digestive system should have allowed. He had spent the previous night in agony, cursing his own pride, swearing vengeance, and consuming an unholy amount of milk and antacid tablets in a desperate attempt to soothe his suffering. But it hadn't been enough. The pepper had one. Rilla had one. And she knew it. The worst part? She had barely reacted to it. It wasn't just that she had eaten one of those hell fruits, she had eaten multiple, casually, as if they were harmless snacks. Which meant that humans weren't the strongest species when it came to food endurance. And that truth was unacceptable. Ethan wasn't used to losing. He wasn't used to sitting in silence, feeling like the inferior species in a competition he hadn't even fully understood until it was too late. But here he was, drinking a pitiful cup of ice water, while Rilla delicately nibbled at her breakfast, victorious and unbothered. He narrowed his eyes. Enjoying yourself? Rilla's amber eyes gleamed as she looked up. Immensely. Ethan scowled. You cheated. Her frills twitched in amusement. I fail to see how presenting you with a food item that is entirely natural to my species is considered cheating. You simply underestimated your own biological limitations. Ethan groaned, rubbing his face. I don't even know how you function after eating those things. I should have seen it coming. Rilla tilted her head, clearly savoring his suffering. You should have, yes. But instead, you let your human arrogance cloud your judgment. Ethan exhaled sharply. All right, you've had your fun. You proved your point. Humans suck at spice. Congratulations. She blinked, setting down her utensils. You admit defeat? Ethan grumbled something incoherent under his breath. Rilla leaned forward. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you repeat it? Ethan clenched his jaw. I said, I admit defeat. Rilla smiled triumphantly, her tail curling behind her in satisfaction. Good. That was a wise conclusion to reach. Ethan groaned again, running a hand through his hair. I hate you. Rilla chuckled. No, you don't. You're simply unaccustomed to being on the losing side of a challenge. Ethan grumbled but didn't deny it. After a moment, Rilla sighed, her smug demeanor softening ever so slightly. I will say, I do respect your persistence. Even when your body was clearly rejecting the experience, you refused to back down. That is admirable. Foolish, but admirable. Ethan gave her a sideways glance. So what? You're saying I impressed you? She clicked her tongue. I am saying you are persistent. There is a difference. Ethan smirked despite himself. Sounds like a compliment. Rilla rolled her eyes. Take it however you wish. For a long moment, they sat in companionable silence, the war between them cooling into something more tolerable, something that felt less like a battle and more like mutual understanding. Ethan sipped his water again, his voice softer when he finally spoke. So, truce? Rilla considered it for a moment, then nodded. Truce. Ethan exhaled in relief. Good. Because if I have to go through another night like that, I'm gonna throw myself out the nearest airlock. Rilla chuckled. That would be unwise. I have no desire to explain to the captain why our xenobiologist self-destructed over a single pepper. Ethan shook his head. Not a single pepper. A biological weapon disguised as a pepper. Rilla smirked. Semantics. Ethan rolled his eyes, but found himself smiling. As much as he hated to admit it, Rilla had earned this victory. He had underestimated her species' ability to handle something humans clearly weren't built for, and in the end, he had paid the price for it. But something strange had happened along the way. They had started out as rivals in a ridiculous food war, but somewhere in the chaos, they had actually learned something about each other. Maybe humans weren't the toughest species in every category. Maybe Tkari had their own strengths that humans couldn't match. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. Ethan set his glass down, glancing at Rilla with a wry grin. So, what now? She lifted an eyebrow. Now? Now, I believe it is my turn to learn about another human delicacy. Ethan blinked. Oh. She folded her hands together. I have decided to be more open-minded. You have survived the Gorthaka pepper, so I shall endeavor to experience another element of human cuisine. Ethan's grin widened. Oh, I like where this is going. Rilla exhaled. Within reason. Ethan nodded. Of course, of course. He tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. All right. You know what? Since you nearly killed me, I think it's only fair I introduce you to something equally challenging. Rilla's eyes narrowed. What do you have in mind? Ethan's smirk turned positively wicked. Sugar. Rilla frowned. Sugar? Ethan leaned in. Ever heard of candy? She tilted her head. I have read about it. Humans use it as a stimulant, correct? A source of quick energy? Ethan nodded. Yep. And since you're all about scientific experiments, I think it's time you experience your first sugar rush. Rilla hesitated. She knew human sugar intake was excessive. Their bodies had developed an almost unnatural craving for refined glucose compounds. But still, she did challenge him first. Her pride would not allow her to refuse. Rilla exhaled. Very well. I accept your challenge. Ethan grinned. You are so gonna regret this. She narrowed her eyes. I highly doubt that. He stood, grabbing his datapad. I'll put in a request for some Earth-imported sweets. Give it a day or two, and we'll see how well Atari handles human sugar levels. Rilla crossed her arms. I look forward to proving you wrong. Ethan smirked. Oh, I can't wait to see that. And just like that, the war wasn't over. It had simply evolved into the next battle.